Aristotle's view of explanation and understanding is provided in his hylomorphic theory of change, in which he refers to three media of change: space, time, matter, four kinds of change: substantial, qualitative, quantitative, and locomotion, three principles of change, four causes, accounts, and three different branches of science to consult for both the understanding of scientific phenomena and their explanation: practical sciences, theoretical sciences, and productive sciences. Kant largely embraces the above matrix and elaborates upon it by providing us with a number of categories of understanding/judgment, which can be found in the different branches of science. Kant condenses a cloud of metaphysical speculation on the nature of the soul into the drops or faculties of sensibility, understanding, and reason, and much effort is expended in characterizing the relation between the a priori intuitions of space and time, sensibility, the categories of the understanding, and the principles of reason. Kant's major task in his mature work, as we know, was to disperse the clouds of metaphysics that had formed as a result of the triumph of Platonism over Aristotelianism in the writings of medieval scholars. Aristotle's works, we also know, as a result were translated into Latin very late 1200s, and when they were, the translation itself was problematic, according to Heidegger. Certain key words of the Greek language did not retain their philosophical meaning, e.g. aletheia, sush, physis, and eudaimonia. The new meanings of these words then helped to form the storm clouds of scholastic metaphysics that Kant felt the need to disperse in his three critiques. Other key terms such as arete, archi, dike, and phronimos were also problematically translated, because their explanatory/justificatory meanings were distorted. Arete, for example, is a trans-categorical term extending over the domain of character, virtue, and action, doing the right thing in the right way at the right time. Kant's strategy was to disenter prevailing theoretical considerations about the nature of God, in favor of practical considerations relating to freedom and the will. For Kant, it was clear that the world of willed phenomena was constitutive of the domain of history. Whatever conception of the freedom of the will one may form in terms of metaphysics, the will's manifestations in the world of phenomena, i.e. human actions, are determined in accordance with natural laws, as is every other natural event. History is concerned with giving an account of these phenomena, no matter how deeply concealed their causes may be, and it allows us to hope that, if it examines the free exercise of the human will on a large scale, it will be able to discover a regular progression among freely willed actions. In the same way, we may hope that what strikes us in the actions of individuals as confused and fortuitous may be recognized in the history of the entire species as a steadily advancing but slow development of man's original capacities. Kant's political writings, Trans Nisbet, H. B. Cambridge, Cup, 1970, page 41. Kant is not generally recognized to be a major political/historical philosopher, but the above quote, taken from an essay entitled Idea for a Universal History, together with another essay from the same collection, entitled Perpetual Peace, are major contributions to both political philosophy and the philosophy of history. The idea of the United Nations was floated in the former essay, leading to the complex idea of human rights incorporating ideas of freedom and legal equality. Both of these principles were needed, in addition to the above reflections, for the kind of extended ethical argumentation one finds in Metaphysics of Morals. All the above works, including the second critique and the groundwork, were clearly recommending that man emancipate himself from his self-incurred immaturity via the founding activity of reconstituting political institutions on rational grounds and principles. A spirit of criticism was directed at authoritarian dogma. This spirit also avoided descending in a skeptical spiral that would deny the importance of ideas of reasons and practical a priori principles. Such a spirit required that man impose these practical a priori principles upon himself, e.g. as expressed by the various formulations of the categorical imperative. This, in turn, suggests that both politics and law require ethical argumentation and reference to necessary and sufficient conditions that are discussed in both of these practical sciences. Necessary and sufficient conditions are, of course, important in contexts of explanation/understanding/justification. The idea of freedom, according to Hans Reis's introduction to Kant's political writings, requires of a government that they refrain from regulating the speech and thought of individual citizens, as well as refrain from regulating individual rights to acquire things in the external world. In the latter case, everyone must respect both the freedom and right to possessions of other individuals. These factors stand or fall together. In totalitarian regimes, freedom of speech is severely limited and corruption is rife in both the economic and legal systems. Politically connected elites dogmatically control many of the institutions in the above systems. Rice. But man's inner life must not be subject to coercion. Because we cannot know for certain anything about another person's inner life, it ought not to be the task of political action or legislation to change or in any way to condition another person's thought. All individuals have this right of acquiring possessions. It is the expression of their freedom. Page 22. Kant clearly sees the realm of freedom to be that which it is the task of human rights to regulate. His vision is not dissimilar to the ancient Greek view that one ought to lead one's life in accordance with principles connected to arete, doing the right thing in the right way at the right time, dike, justice, and phronesis. The categorical imperative incorporates aspects of these ideas of reason, especially the practically oriented second formulation which demands that we so act as to treat other people as ends in themselves. Kant elaborates upon the Greek position by forming the technical concept of the will, a concept that is definitely a consequence of reflection upon the different formulations of the categorical imperative, which all prioritize acting in accordance with one's duty over acting in accordance with sensibly based personal appetites and desires. Citizens, on Kant's view, are active agents, acting collectively, with a general universal will. The outcome of a long period of activity will, on Kant's view, result in the establishment of a cosmopolitan kingdom of ends composed of cosmopolitan citizens respecting each other's freedom. To be clear, what is being discussed here is not a Hegelian final solution of a spiritual end that disregards Kantian categories in favor of a dialectical march of opposites to some kind of absolute terminus. Rice points to the role of teleology in Kant's view of history. When Kant talks of plans of nature in history, he does not mean that there is an actual legislator or mind called nature which has consciously made a plan to be carried out in history, but merely that if we wish to understand history as, according to him, we must resort to an idea such as that nature has a purpose in history. This idea cannot be proved or disproved by a scientific inquiry, but without it, we cannot understand history at all. Page 36. This is part of the Kantian account of explanation/understanding. Two important implications of this account are: a rational idea is a condition of the possibility for understanding history, and this rational idea is an idea in the mind of man that cannot be demonstrated or proved. The mind referred to above, however, is not a mind constituted of personal individual memories and private events. Rather, we are here dealing with a form of consciousness, possessing active power emanating from different regions of consciousness: sensibility, understanding/judgment, and reason. Ricouer's view of explanation/understanding in history is convoluted, but it is clear that he is skeptical of certain aspects of both the hylomorphic and critical accounts. He begins his investigation not with the material condition of testimony that is incorporated into documentation, nor with the historical text that is the telos of the historical work of remembering, engaged in by historians. Of course, there is a sense in which documentation explains testimony because the latter is a necessary condition of the former. If, however, one is concerned with characterizing the whole historical process in, for example, hylomorphic terms, then the form, principle, or telos of the work of remembering that is involved in testimony suggests that this latter is an important element in determining the final form of the historical text. Ricoeur has, in other works, Interpretation Theory, Discourse and the Surplus of Meaning, Fort Worth, Texan Christian University Press, 1976, pointed out that writing explodes the dialogical situation in which speech acts are directed at specific audiences present at these acts. Writing, Ricoeur insists, may be addressed to an audience that has yet to be born. Nevertheless, the implication of such distanciation is that there is a responsibility placed upon the author to anticipate the responses of any audience by incorporating in his text a response to their responses. This can be characterized as a work of expectation that ought to complement any work of remembering, which might be incorporated in the text. The historical text differentiates itself from other kinds of text by the fact that it is meant to be about long spans of time, and must also be valid for long periods of time. The problem with conceptualizing long periods of time is that of deciding which categories to use for this task. Historians have tended to favor using the category of fact rather than action, because statistical techniques are more relevant to the former. This approach also opens up the realm of probability theory in possible explanations of the phenomena one is dealing with. Bayes' theorem, that the probability of an event is related to the information about that event, construes this information in terms of facts rather than actions, and thus excludes the use of practical reasoning in favor of a mathematical form of mathematical reasoning. Involved in this decision, we can detect a skepticism with reference to the work of expectation, relating to anticipating actions that occur in contexts of exploration/discovery. Such work focuses upon the unknown consequences of action, rather than the constitutive logical characterization of action, where the consequences of action are logically or conceptually related to the reasons that are given for that action in contexts of explanation/justification. History is concerned with action in a context of a long temporal span and therefore with long-term consequences. Its task must include explaining in general terms why the action has occurred, and this in turn requires a focus on both cause and consequence in relation to the category of actuality, rather than the category of hypothetical possibility, which classifies the action as a Y rather than an X. In this work, the logical identity of the action must be established before there can be investigations into its causality and consequences. Attempts at establishing what has been done occurs in an inductive context of exploration/discovery. The historian does not consult the documents in an archive in order to identify actions of magnitude and significance. Rather, the concern ought to be for providing the evidence for already identified actions and the why, the reasons for and the causes of the action. The action recorded is rarely an ongoing event like swimming. We are rather dealing with past actions whose consequences have largely occurred, e.g. expressed in the following terms in the above non-historical example: the swimmer swam to the nearby island. Here the logical identity of the action is not at issue, but is rather named or rigidly designated in the above expression, which is an answer to the question, why was the swimmer swimming? This is consistent with the Kantian quote above, in which reference is made to the idea of purpose, or telos in history, insofar as this relates to actions/events of magnitude/significance and the free exercise of the human will. Ricouer claims that G.E.R. Lloyd's work Demystifying Mentalities, New York, Cup, 1990, attempts to replace the expression the plurality of mentalities with another expression, namely, styles of inquiry. This latter expression has more of a descriptive intent than the former, and belongs not in contexts of explanation/justification but rather in contexts of exploration/discovery. Freud's relation to history is also discussed, and this is particularly interesting and relevant, given the clear relationship there is between the activities that occur in the dialogical relation of the analyst/analysand in the psychoanalytical situation, and the equally clear relationship there is to the more structured institutional relation of judge to legal tribunal. Both proceedings involve a work of remembering, at the level firstly, of the individual, and secondly, at an institutional level where documents are created, archived, and accessed. Involved in such activity, especially insofar as early historical documents were concerned, is a phenomenon Freud wished to categorize as collective repression. Freud suggests this pathological phenomenon might have occurred in relation to the records concerning the assassination of Moses. The biblical story merely has Moses dying before entry into the Promised Land, and this may be a half-truth necessitated by a wish fulfillment related to an admired father figure. Ricoeur refers to Norbert Elias and his work, The Civilising Process, Trans Jeffcott, E. Malden, Mass., Blackwell 2000, as a text of importance insofar as the history of the term representation is concerned. There is, it is claimed, an interesting point of differentiation between a feudal state, e.g. the Ancien Regime, and the civilizing process going on in the liberation from such feudal forces, which, as we know, result in states monopolizing the financing of a society, taxation, as well as the right to coerce in the name of the law. Elias focuses upon the relation of interdependence that exists between the political organization of a society and its changing sensibilities and behavior patterns. In this discussion there is no reference to the Aristotelian political vision of the political task of the creation of a large middle class, situated between the Platonic democrats, disgruntled sons of oligarchs, and the feudal oligarchs. Such a middle class will be formed, Aristotle argues, by the principle of the golden mean, which navigates a course, through the realm of behavior patterns and sensibilities, between bipolar extremes. The golden mean is the virtue-forming principle, and part of this process of course involves widespread public education which in both its content and its form will be related to the forming of both intellectual and moral virtues. This, for Aristotle, is part of his civilising process, or actualisation process, that is working toward the telos of installing the power of rationality, intellectual and moral, in mankind. Elias does not reason in the above hylomorphic terms, but instead refers to the more modern expressions of psychic economy and historical psychology, page 208, connecting these to a process he calls rationalisation. Rationalisation, it is argued, is a process that regulates both emotions and social settings. This, Ricoeur claims, is more than what the history of ideas calls reason, page 208. Ricoeur maintains that this process is involved in the forming of habits, and the implication is clearly that this process is not rational in the sense Aristotle used the term but is rather non-rational. For Aristotle, the process of the golden mean was essentially a rational process implying the operation of consciousness. Aristotle's account of non-rational habit formation is involved in the conscious operation of reason after non-rational habits such as cowardice in the face of the enemy are formed. There is some form of conscious evaluation of this irrational habit and a new type of response to the enemy is formed, e.g. rushing unintelligently into battle. This habit is equally irrational and is a far cry from the demands of arete, doing the right thing in the right way at the right time. Conscious evaluation then uses the principle of the golden mean and navigates a course somewhere in between the extremes. In the future, these bad habits will perhaps still be present in the memory system and might require the operation of consciousness to select the new rational habit. The installation of the virtuous habit is certainly neither irrational nor rational, but rather the epitome of what Aristotle calls rational. It is not rationalizing. In talking about his civilising process, Elias has the following to say. But it is by no means impossible that we can make out of it, civilization, something more reasonable, something that functions in terms of needs and purposes. Page 367, Civilizing Process. Reference to purpose in the above is interesting, because it demands a recognition of action, and a relation to the formal and final causes that help to form a teleological explanation/justification. Now it is the case that history and its work of remembering requires a truth orientation to objects in the past. The historian may, of course, in their final reflections on their material, in the course of the preparations for the production of a historical text, refer to the civilizing process, or what Aristotle would call the actualisation process. The language of the historian becomes more teleological and in accordance with the practical rational principles, non-contradiction and sufficient reason, at all levels of reflection. Ricoeur, as part of his hermeneutical approach which he once described in terms of being the long road to the understanding of being that Heidegger he argued approached directly, wishes to focus upon a rationalizing process rather than the rational outcome of the process. As part of one of his themes, the conflict of interpretations, Ricoeur quotes Pascal. Diversity. A town or a landscape from afar off is a town or a landscape, but as one approaches it becomes houses, trees, tiles, leaves, grass, ants' legs, and so on ad infinitum. Pascal, Pences, Transkrailshamer, A. J. Baltimore, Penguin, 1966, 48, 65. A historian, it is argued, chooses the scale of reflection to be used, e.g. economical, geographical, institutional, or social, on the ground of mentalities associated with these alternatives. This in turn makes possible an interplay between these levels as well as a dialectical discussion. Here we are not talking about seeing the same thing under different aspects, but rather, different things. Page 211. Such attention to detail permits a change of priorities and allows the historian to focus upon events relating to the subordinate class. This focus upgrades these events to events of magnitude/significance that suffice therefore to be plucked from the archives and manifested in historical texts, e.g. the burning of a miller at the stake. In this refocusing, the life and worldview of the subordinate class becomes an issue of importance. Ricoeur believes that focusing upon the events of village life is beginning at the bottom. Ricoeur arrives at the conclusion that this concept of mentality is too vague to perform the historical work of remembering. He suggests that we instead focus upon the concept of representation, enriched by the phenomenological reflections of Husserl and Merleau-Ponty, page 217. The idea of collective representation emerges, and focus shifts from worldviews to social bonding. Unfortunately, in this discussion, the notion of justification is relativized, and the perspective of scale is used. The criteria of workable justifications, it is argued, differs from city to city. In this process of reflection, the normative element of justification, expressed in terms of ought premises and conclusions, is reduced to factual premises that form the basis for a successful agreement, which is then imitatively repeated via rationalizing habit formations. This pattern of behavior is not in any sense categorical, but rather part of a dialectical process that leads to a non-rational result. In the context of this discussion, Ricoeur prefers to refer to what he calls the category of uncertainty, page 226, which he then attempts to attach to the categorical idea of trustworthiness. Reference is also made to the rules of the social game and its strategic logic, page 226. Representation is then unsurprisingly placed in a dialectical context in relation to the political field, page 227, and given many meanings. The discussion rotates back to the faithfulness of memory which preceded the truth of history, page 229. This essentially epistemological focus on the moment of representation thus neutralizes both Aristotelian and Kantian rationalism, which prioritizes the world of will over the world of representation in practical contexts. The theoretical form of the village is not merely subsumed theoretically under the form of the city but is practical matter, formed by the practical rational principle of the law-governed city.